Violence is an inherent aspect to all life forms, as all life forms have a concept of attack or defense. The cell membrane on an amoeba, the thorns on a rose bush, the teeth and claws of a tiger, the speed and agility of a rabbit, white blood cells, and even our skin are examples of how life forms have a sense of their boundaries and possess tools needed in order for them to survive. The will to survive is one of the few things all life forms have in common. Therefore, human beings are no exception. Violence, as such, is characteristic to human beings. In fact, humans are a prime example of how life requires violence in order to survive. Governments are in place to give order and structure to the lives of people, and they are charged with the task of protecting them and serve in their best interest. The use of violence is a highly contentious issue in politics and in society, but despite that, it is one of the most effective methods of attaining one's goals. Contrary to the morals or ethics of certain individuals, violence has settled more disputes and has attained more goals in history than any other force. While the ethics of using such force can certainly be debated, few can contest the effectiveness of force when that force is supported by a credible threat. However, the decision to use force depends not only on the ethics of such a decision, but also on whether the outcome will result favorably on the side of the aggressor. This is the key issue that must be considered, and forms the basis of all power struggles. Non-state entities can certainly use violence to achieve their objectives as long as the probability of military victory is high. However, there is little chance of military victory. The non-state actor must utilize other means of achieving their objectives, as military defeat could have far-reaching consequences that will make the loser pay dearly for their miscalculated decision to use force. There is no fundamental difference between a state entity using violence and a non-state entity using violence, other than the fact that the state entity usually has a higher and more powerful military to reinforce a credible threat of violence. Therefore, they have a higher probability of victory if they ever engage a smaller non-state entity in battle. A question that often comes up is, does a non-state entity have the right to use violence? The reality, however, is that there are no rights granted to either the state nor the non-state entity. It's merely a matter of whether or not violence is an effective means to achieving one's goals. In other words, using violent force to make the opposing side do what you want them to do. A non-state entity must weigh the consequences of their actions and then decide what course of action to take. In the American Civil Rights Movement, there were two opposing ideologies on how to achieve equal rights for African Americans in the United States. The first was the use of nonviolent civil disobedience, which was prominently espoused by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., while the other was the use of self-defense or even direct violent force to achieve human rights, which was espoused by Malcolm X. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did not believe that the use of violent force would be a feasible method of achieving equal rights with white Americans, because it was not realistic to think that an insurrection mounted by black Americans would be capable of defeating military and police forces of the American government. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. argued that violent insurrection was successful in Cuba because the rebels had the support of the military and the majority. The current government could not stand before such an opponent. However, the American government had the support of the white majority, the police, and the military forces, and none of these groups would be likely to support a violent rebellion by the black minority. Dr. King states, Castro may have only had a few Cubans actually fighting with him and up in the hills. Yes, but he would never have overthrown the Batista regime unless he had the sympathy of the vast majority of Cuban people. It is perfectly clear that a violent rebellion on the part of the American blacks would find no sympathy and support from the white population, and very little from the majority of Negroes themselves. Therefore, the only means that they had at their disposal were nonviolent civil disobedience tactics. Such methods utilized direct violation of what the dissenters perceived as unjust laws and social customs which discriminated against blacks. Nonviolent means of attaining civil rights, the goals of the non-state entity would include sit-ins, boycotts, and public protests. However, it must also be pointed out that civil disobedience is not the same as passive resistance. Passive resistance, while nonviolent, is resisting arrest and is counterproductive to the ideals of violating unjust laws. For civil disobedience to work, unjust laws must not only be violated, but the consequences of the violations of those laws must also be accepted. If they are not, it would change the perceived motive of the dissenters from freedom fighters to criminals. Public perception is the main weapon of the act of civil disobedience. The Birmingham campaign is a prime example of how public perception was used to the advantage of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, also known as the SCLC, to fight against the government and their laws. In this particular case, the campaign was a success, and the SCLC won the support of the silent majority who were outraged by the photos taken in Birmingham. While civil disobedience is non-violent on the part of the dissenters, it is inherently violent because the civil disobedience invokes conflict, which usually leads to violence on the part of the opposing party. The photos taken from Birmingham demonstrate this very well, as protesters were fired upon by police using high-powered water hoses. The use of violence against non-aggressive protesters has far-reaching influence on the silent majority, and that was the most effective weapon during the American Civil Rights Movement. Violent insurrection is another tactic that can be employed as a method of obtaining goals. However, the decision to use violence must be carefully calculated, as it cannot be used irrationally. Malcolm X renounced his allegiance and citizenship to the United States. Malcolm X states, "I am not a politician. I'm not a student of politics. In fact, I'm not a student of much of anything. I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I don't even consider myself American. If you and I were Americans, there'd be no problem. Those honkies that just got off the boat, they're already American. Polacks are already Americans. The Italian refugees are already Americans. Everything that came out of Europe, every blue-eyed thing, is already an American. And as long as you and I have been over here, we aren't Americans yet." He did not consider himself an American citizen, and therefore his fight for equal rights was not based on the rights that blacks should have under the United States government, but rights that blacks should have for just being human beings. Therefore his plight was a human rights movement. He did not feel like he had to convince the American government of the wrongs they committed. From his point of view, they were the criminals, and they were the ones responsible for creating the problem of racial inequality in the first place. Therefore, taking the case of equal rights to the American government was absurd. Rather, he wanted to take his case to the United Nations. Since he saw the white majority and the American government as criminals, he had no compunction against using violence against them to attain their goals. Malcolm X espoused racial segregation, which ironically mirrored the status quo at the time. Malcolm X argued that there has never been a nonviolent revolution, and white America was hypocritical for condemning him for condoning violence, due to their constant use of violence in the various wars that America was involved in, particularly the American Revolution. The point Malcolm X brings up is a valid one. Is it truly hypocritical to accept one's government for using violence, but condemn a non-state entity for using it? The reality is, the majority always holds the upper hand when it comes to political relations, and thus they can voice their opinions more prominently, and the majority listening are more likely to accept the viewpoints of those of their own, in this case, white Americans. The opposing side will be given pejorative names such as rebels or terrorists as a means of labeling them as the wrong side or evil side, while theirs maintains the moral high ground. However, this only demonstrates the nature of having a particular point of view. Malcolm X is correct in stating that white Americans used the same tactics, in this case violence, to attain their goals of freedom and equality. Therefore, they would indeed be hypocrites for condemning the use of violence by a rebel group seeking the same exact goals. Nevertheless, convincing them of their own hypocrisy would have little effect on achieving Malcolm X's goals. War is not won by convincing the other side that they are wrong, and you are right. They are won through violent force. And Malcolm X felt that nonviolent methods were tedious and ineffective. Despite that, history proves that it was Malcolm X's methods that were the ones that were ultimately fruitless. Blacks were faced off against not only the government, but the silent majority who feared and distrusted them. Their forces simply were not powerful enough to challenge the much more powerful forces employed by the United States. In addition, the silent majority would never rally to the cause of blacks because an attack against the government or an attack against white civilians would be seen as an attack against them, which would lead to them supporting the government, not the dissenters. The non-state entity in this case has no meaningful chance of achieving military victory, and thus using violence to achieve equal rights was ineffective.